After a bad car accident, I asked my wife to pick me up from the ER. She replied, "Sorry, I'm at lunch with my male best friend. Can't just leave." I texted, "Okay." What the police officer told her when they approached her table at the restaurant changed everything about her dinner with her friend. You know that feeling when you're so close to home, you can practically taste your couch? That's exactly where I was at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that started like any other crappy day in paradise. 14 hours of dealing with overdoses, heart attacks, and one particularly memorable case involving a guy who somehow got his head stuck in a mailbox. Don't ask me how, because even after 12 years as a paramedic, I'm still trying to figure that one out. The rain was coming down like God had a personal vendetta against anyone trying to get home safely. My windshield wipers were doing their best impression of an asthmatic trying to run a marathon, and I was squinting through the streaks thinking about nothing more complicated than a cold beer and maybe catching the tail end of whatever garbage was on late-night TV. Simple pleasures, you know? The kind of stuff you take for granted until life decides to play a little game I like to call, "Let's see how fast we can screw up Marcus's evening." I was maybe 3 blocks from my apartment, close enough that I was already mentally rehearsing my "honey, I'm home" routine for Camille. Though let's be honest, she was probably already asleep with her fancy silk eye mask and those ridiculous earplugs she insisted on wearing because apparently the world was too loud for her delicate sensibilities. But hey, that's marriage, right? You love someone despite their quirks, even when those quirks include treating sleep like it's some kind of sacred ritual that requires more preparation than a NASA launch. The intersection of 5th and Marshall was coming up. You know, that sketchy one where half the streetlights are always busted and the other half flicker like they're auditioning for a horror movie. I slowed down because, call it professional paranoia, but when you've scraped enough people off the pavement, you tend to drive like your grandmother on a Sunday afternoon. The light was green, had been green for a good 10 seconds, so I started rolling through, already thinking about how I was going to explain to Camille why I was late again. That's when I heard it. The sound that every paramedic knows but never wants to hear when they're not on the job. The angry roar of an engine pushed way past its limits, tires screaming against wet asphalt like banshees with a noise complaint. I had maybe half a second to think, "Oh, this is gonna suck," before the world went completely sideways. The souped-up Honda Civic, and yes, I caught the make and model even as it was busy rearranging my life, came flying through that red light like it was more of a suggestion than an actual traffic law. The kid behind the wheel couldn't have been more than 20, probably hopped up on energy drinks, and that special kind of stupidity that makes you think you're invincible right up until physics decides to teach you otherwise. Impact. That's all I remember for a split second. Pure, concentrated impact that felt like getting hit by a freight train made of spite and poor life choices. My driver's side door caved in like it was made of tinfoil, and suddenly I was intimately acquainted with parts of my car that were never meant to be interior features. Glass exploded everywhere, tiny diamonds of pain that sparkled in the streetlight before gravity pulled them down like the world's most painful snow. The screaming started immediately, mine, his, and about 3 different car alarms that decided this was the perfect time to remind everyone that they existed. The rain kept falling because apparently, Mother Nature doesn't pause for personal catastrophes, and it mixed with something warm running down my face that I was pretty sure wasn't sweat. My left arm was making a shape that arms definitely aren't supposed to make, bent at an angle that would have been impressive if it weren't attached to me. The pain hit in waves, starting as a dull roar and building to a crescendo that made my teeth ache. My head felt like someone was using it as a bass drum, and when I tried to focus on anything specific, the world kept sliding in and out of focus like a broken camera lens. Then came the darkness. Not the peaceful kind you get when you're falling asleep after a good day, but the heavy, oppressive kind that feels like being buried alive. I could hear voices getting farther away, sirens in the distance getting closer, and the steady patter of rain on metal that sounded like applause for the universe's latest joke at my expense. When I came back to something resembling consciousness, I was staring up at faces I recognized. Jimmy Rodriguez and Sarah Chun from Station 19, 2 of the best paramedics in the city, and people I'd worked alongside more times than I could count. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was now on the receiving end of the same professional calm I'd used on countless patients over the years. "Easy there," Marcus, Jimmy was saying, his voice carrying that practiced reassurance we all learned to use when things were bad, but not hopeless. We got you, man. Just stay with us. My vision kept swimming in and out of focus, but I could make out the familiar ritual. The careful extraction, the neck brace, the backboard that always felt like lying on a medieval torture device. Sarah was doing the thing with my arm that I'd done 1,000 times myself, the gentle probing that tells you everything you need to know about how badly you're screwed. Officer Ronan Pierce showed up just as they were loading me into the ambulance. Good old Ronan, who'd been dealing with the aftermath of car crashes almost as long as I'd been patching up the survivors. We'd grabbed beers together, complained about the job, shared the kind of dark humor that keeps you sane when you spend your days cleaning up other people's worst moments. He leaned in close, his face serious in that way cops get when they're about to ask the important questions. Marcus, buddy, we need to notify someone. You got an emergency contact? Family we should call. Through the haze of pain and whatever lovely cocktails they'd already started pumping into my four, I managed to croak out the name that should have been the easiest thing in the world to say, my wife. Camille, please call her. Even through the fog of shock and medication, I remember thinking it was funny how those 3 words, my wife Camille, suddenly felt heavier than they ever had before. Like I was handing over something precious and hoping it wouldn't get dropped. The ride to St. Jude's emergency room was a blur of flashing lights, radio chatter, and that special kind of professional efficiency that I'd been on the delivering end of more times than I could count. Now that I was the guy strapped to the gurney, getting the full customer experience, I had to admit we made this look way easier than it actually was. Every bump in the road felt like someone was playing xylophone on my ribs, and my left arm was sending up distress signals that would have made the Titanic jealous. Jimmy kept talking to me the whole way, standard protocol to keep the patient conscious and responsive, though in my case it was more like keeping me from sliding into the kind of self-pity that comes with realizing you're about to become a statistic in your own field. Stay with us, Marcus. We're almost there. Sarah's got your vitals looking good, and that arm's gonna heal up just fine. You know the drill. Yeah, I knew the drill all right. I also knew that looking good in paramedic speak usually translated to not actively dying at this very moment, which, considering the circumstances, I was willing to accept as a win. St. Jude's ER on a Tuesday night was exactly what you'd expect. Controlled chaos with a side of fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie. The triage nurse, a battle-hardened woman named Betty who'd been working these halls since before I was old enough to know what a stethoscope was, took one look at me and started the paperwork dance that turns human suffering into billable hours. They got me onto one of those hospital beds that somehow managed to be both too hard and too soft at the same time, and within minutes I was hooked up to more machines than a NASA control room. The pain meds hit my system like a warm wave of artificial happiness, taking the edge off everything and making the world feel like it was wrapped in cotton batting. Dr. Jennifer Walsh showed up looking like she'd been pulled from a medical textbook, competent, professional, and carrying that particular brand of exhaustion that comes with spending your nights putting people back together. She poked and prodded with the kind of thoroughness that would have been impressive if it weren't happening to me. Well, Marcus, she said, consulting her clipboard with the satisfied air of someone who'd just solved a particularly interesting puzzle. You've got yourself a nice clean break in your left radius. Should heal up just fine with a cast and some patience. The concussion's mild, but we'll want to keep an eye on that. All things considered, you got pretty lucky tonight. Lucky, right. Nothing says lucky like getting T-boned by a kid who probably thought traffic laws were more like traffic suggestions. But I'd seen enough crashes to know she was right. I could have been scraped off the pavement with a spatula, so I guess lucky was relative. That's when the question I'd been dreading finally came up. Betty the triage nurse appeared at my bedside with that particular look that nurses get when they're about to deliver news that's going to make your day significantly worse. Honey, she said, and already I knew this wasn't going to be good because Betty only called people honey when she was about to break bad news gently. We've been trying to reach your wife like you asked. Called her 3 times now, but she's not picking up. I stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the little holes in the acoustic panels while my brain processed this information. 3 calls. 3 attempts to reach the person who was supposed to be my emergency contact, my ride or die, my better half. The person who should have dropped everything, and come running the moment she heard I was hurt. But I already knew where she was, didn't I? Tuesday lunch with Damian Price, her best friend, who had more money than sense and enough fake deep philosophy to choke a horse. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, they'd meet up at some trendy cafe downtown to discuss art and literature and whatever other pretentious garbage trust fund babies talked about when they weren't busy inheriting their way through life. Damian was one of those guys who wore designer jeans to look casual and quoted Nietzsche at dinner parties like he'd personally discovered philosophy. The kind of guy who called himself an entrepreneur but never seemed to actually do any work, unless you counted posting inspirational quotes on Instagram as a legitimate business venture. Camille always insisted he was like a brother to her, which might have been more convincing if brothers typically looked at their sisters the way I'd caught him looking at my wife. But hey, what did I know? I was just the husband who worked 14-hour shifts saving lives while she discussed the deeper meaning of abstract art over $20 salads. The pain meds made my fingers feel like they belonged to someone else, but I managed to fish my phone out of my pocket with my good hand. The screen was cracked, probably happened during my intimate encounter with that Honda Civic, but it still worked well enough to send a text. I typed slowly, each letter a small victory against the fog in my brain. Car accident. I'm at St. Jude's ER. Broken arm. Can you pick me up? I hit send and waited. The little delivered notification popped up immediately, so I knew the message went through. Then came the 3 dots that meant she was typing back, and for a moment I felt this pathetic surge of relief. Maybe she'd panic. Maybe she'd apologize profusely for not answering. Maybe she'd drop everything and rush over like a normal person would when their spouse ended up in the hospital. The response that came back was a masterclass in exactly how not to react when your husband nearly dies in a car crash. Ugh, Marcus, that sucks. But I'm at lunch with Damian. It's important. Can you get a cab? Let me know how it goes. I read it once, then again, then a third time because surely I was misunderstanding something. Maybe the concussion was affecting my reading comprehension. Maybe the pain meds were making me see things that weren't there. But no. There it was in black and white on my cracked phone screen. Her husband was in the emergency room, and her primary concern was that it might inconvenience her very important lunch date with her very important friend who wore scarves in July and thought having opinions about wine made him interesting. Ugh, Marcus, that sucks. Like I'd told her I was stuck in traffic or ran out of milk. Can you get a cab? Because nothing says loving spouse support quite like suggesting your injured husband take public transportation home from the hospital. The really beautiful part was, let me know how it goes. As if my medical emergency was some kind of minor inconvenience that she'd check in on later when it was more convenient for her social calendar. I stared at that message for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, feeling something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with the accident. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Except the house was my marriage, and the cards were all the little compromises and excuses I'd made over the years. Betty came back to check on me, and I could tell from her expression that she'd been hoping for better news about my emergency contact situation. Any luck reaching your wife, honey? I held up my phone, showing her the text exchange. Betty read it, and I watched her professional nurse expression crack just slightly around the edges. Oh, she said. And that one word contained about 17 different kinds of disapproval. I managed what I hoped was a smile, though it probably looked more like a grimace. Yeah. Oh. With my good hand, I slowly typed out a response that would have won awards for understatement. Okay. Just okay. Because really, what else was there to say? My wife had just told me that her lunch plans were more important than her husband's trip to the emergency room, and somehow, lying there in that hospital bed with machines beeping around me and my arm throbbing despite the medication, that one word felt like the most honest thing I'd said in years. You know that moment when you're standing at the edge of a cliff and you realize you have 2 choices, step back to safety or jump into the unknown. That's exactly where I was, lying in that sterile hospital bed with nothing but the steady beep of machines and the distant sound of other people's emergencies echoing through the halls. The pain meds had kicked in full force by now, wrapping everything in a nice fuzzy blanket of artificial calm, but my mind was crystal clear in a way it hadn't been in years. That text from Camille, all 23 words of pure, concentrated selfishness, had done something to me that no amount of medication could touch. It wasn't just disappointment anymore, though God knows I'd had plenty of practice with that particular emotion over the past few years of our marriage. No, this was something else entirely. This was the sound of the last thread snapping, the final straw breaking the camel's back, the moment when you realize you've been playing a game where only one person knew the rules. I stared at my phone screen until the letters started to blur together, reading that message over and over like maybe if I looked at it enough times, the words would magically rearrange themselves into something that resembled basic human decency. But nope. There it was in all its glory, a perfect little snapshot of exactly how much my wife valued our relationship when it came into conflict with her social calendar. The really beautiful part was how she'd signed off with "let me know how it goes," like she was checking in on a dentist appointment or waiting to hear how a job interview went. Not, "I'm coming right now." Not, "Oh my God, are you okay?" Not even, "I'll be there as soon as I can." Just a casual request for updates when convenient, like I was live tweeting my medical emergency for her entertainment. Betty walked by again, giving me that look that nurses perfect over years of dealing with people at their lowest points. Part sympathy, part professional concern, and part barely concealed judgment about the quality of my life choices. I caught her eye and tried for a smile that probably came out looking more like a grimace. "You hanging in there, honey?" she asked, and I could tell she was thinking about that text exchange she'd witnessed earlier. "Oh, I'm just peachy," I managed, which was about as much sarcasm as I could muster through the pharmaceutical haze. "Living the dream over here." She patted my good arm with the kind of gentle firmness that only comes from years of dealing with people who are having the worst day of their lives. "You need anything? Someone else we can call maybe." That's when the idea hit me, not like a lightning bolt of inspiration, but more like a slow, warm realization that I actually had options here. See, the thing about being married to someone for 6 years is that you learn their routines, their habits, their little rituals. And Camille's Tuesday lunch with Damien wasn't just any old lunch. It was a production, a carefully orchestrated performance of sophistication and culture that always happened at the same place, at the same time, with the same pretentious attention to detail. The Marlowe Cafe, downtown, where they served $15 avocado toast and called it artisanal, because apparently adding an adjective made it worth 3 times what normal toast should cost. Where Damien would hold forth about whatever book he'd skimmed that week, while Camille hung on his every word like he was dispensing wisdom from on high, instead of just regurgitating shit he'd read on Wikipedia. I knew exactly where she was, and more importantly, I knew she'd be there for at least another hour because Camille never cut these lunches short. They were too important to her self-image, too central to whatever fantasy she'd built about herself as some kind of intellectual socialite who discussed philosophy over wine at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. The pain meds were making me feel loose and reckless in a way that probably should have been a warning sign, but instead felt like permission. Permission to stop being the understanding husband, the guy who made excuses for his wife's behavior, the pushover who accepted, "I'm busy with Damien," as a reasonable response to a medical emergency. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through my contacts until I found Ronan's number. Officer Ronan Pierce, good old reliable Ronan, who'd been dealing with the aftermath of people's bad decisions for almost as long as I'd been patching up the results. We'd grabbed beers together after particularly rough shifts, commiserated about the job, shared the kind of gallows humor that keeps you sane when your daily routine involves cleaning up other people's worst moments. More importantly, Ronan was exactly the kind of by-the-book cop who took emergency notifications seriously. The kind of guy who believed that when someone ended up in the hospital, their emergency contact should actually be contacted, even if it meant interrupting their very important lunch date. My finger hovered over his number for just a moment while the last rational part of my brain tried to talk me out of what I was about to do. This was petty, it whispered. This was vindictive. This was going to cause a scene and embarrass Camille in front of her precious friend and probably end up making things worse between us in the long run. But you know what? That rational voice could go straight to hell, because it had been making excuses for Camille's behavior for years. And where had that gotten me? Lying alone in a hospital bed while my wife prioritized her social life over my well-being. I hit the call button. Ronan picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and concern that cops use when they're not sure if they're about to deal with an emergency or just another routine call. Pierce here. Marcus? How you holding up, buddy? Hey, Ronan, I said, and even through the medication fog, I could hear something different in my own voice, something harder, more resolved. I'm doing okay, all things considered, but I've got a situation with my emergency contact. Yeah? What's going on? I could picture him on the other end of the line, probably sitting in his patrol car or at his desk, already reaching for a pen because Ronan was the kind of cop who took notes about everything. Detail-oriented, thorough, the type of guy who crossed every T and dotted every I because he understood that sometimes the little things mattered more than anyone realized. She didn't answer her phone. I said, which was technically true, just not the whole story. But I know where she is. The Marlowe Cafe downtown. Table by the window, probably. Maybe you could notify her in person? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in Ronan's head. He knew me well enough to know that I wasn't the type to cause drama without a good reason. But he also knew me well enough to sense that there was more to this story than I was letting on. You sure about this, Marcus? He asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested he understood exactly what I was asking him to do. You want us to send officers to notify her at a restaurant? I closed my eyes, letting the weight of the moment settle around me like a blanket. This was it, the point of no return, the moment when I stopped being the guy who accepted whatever scraps of attention his wife felt like throwing his way and started being the guy who demanded better. I'm sure, I said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually meant it. All right then, I'll send a couple officers over. You just focus on getting better, okay? Rest easy, Marcus. I hung up the phone and leaned back against the pillows, closing my eyes and letting a smile spread across my face. The first genuine smile I'd felt in months. Somewhere across town, Camille's very important lunch was about to get a very interesting interruption, and for once in our relationship, she was going to have to deal with the consequences of her choices in front of an audience she actually cared about impressing. The machines kept beeping their steady rhythm, but somehow the sound felt different now, less like a countdown to disaster and more like a metronome keeping time for whatever came next. The Marlowe Cafe was exactly the kind of place that charged $17 for a salad and called it an experience. All exposed brick and Edison bulbs, with mismatched vintage furniture that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and a menu written in that pretentious font that makes you squint to figure out what the hell you're actually ordering. It was the type of establishment that attracted people who wanted to be seen being cultured, where conversations about sustainability happened over imported water and the waitstaff all looked like they were auditioning for indie films between shifts. Camille and Damien had claimed their usual spot by the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the street, prime real estate for people watching and, more importantly, for being watched. She was wearing that cream-colored blouse she'd spent way too much money on, the one that made her feel sophisticated and worldly, paired with the gold jewelry that caught the afternoon light just right. Damien was in his standard uniform of artfully distressed jeans and a button-down that probably cost more than most people's weekly grocery budget, his perfectly tousled hair looking like he'd just rolled out of bed if beds came with personal stylists. They looked like a spread from some lifestyle magazine. Two beautiful people having a beautiful conversation in a beautiful space, completely insulated from the harsh realities of the world outside their bubble of privilege and pretension. Camille was laughing at something Damien had said, that musical laugh she used when she wanted to seem charmed and delighted, while he gestured with his wine glass like he was conducting an orchestra of his own brilliance. The other diners were the usual crowd you'd expect at a place like this. Young professionals trying to impress clients, stay-at-home moms treating themselves to an expensive lunch away from the kids, and a few genuine food enthusiasts who didn't mind paying premium prices for what was admittedly pretty decent cuisine. Everyone was absorbed in their own little worlds of conversation and carefully curated experiences, the kind of people who photographed their food before eating it and posted reviews on Yelp that used words like elevated and transcendent. That's when the atmosphere shifted. The front door opened with the little electronic chime that announced new arrivals. But instead of another pair of well-dressed diners or a nervous couple on a first date, two police officers walked in. Not detectives in suits trying to blend in, but full uniform, badge and gun wearing, official business police officers who looked like they meant business and weren't particularly interested in the artisanal bread service. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations didn't just pause, they died mid-sentence, leaving behind the kind of silence that only happens when something completely unexpected crashes into a carefully controlled environment. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Wine glasses froze in mid-sip, and every head in the place turned toward the door like they were watching a tennis match where the ball had just exploded. Officer Janet Mills led the way, a tall, no-nonsense woman with about 15 years of experience dealing with people on what were usually the worst days of their lives. Her partner, Officer David Chun, followed close behind, both of them scanning the room with the practiced efficiency of cops who knew how to spot what they were looking for in a crowd. Their boots made solid, authoritative sounds against the polished concrete floor, a rhythmic counterpoint to the sudden hush that had fallen over the entire restaurant. They approached Camille's table with the kind of purposeful stride that left no doubt about their destination. Every eye in the place was following their progress, and I could practically feel the collective intake of breath as the other diners realized they were about to witness some kind of drama unfold in real time. Officer Mills stopped directly beside Camille's chair, her presence commanding and impossible to ignore. Damien's fork was still suspended in midair, a piece of arugula dangling from it like a green flag of surrender, while Camille looked up with the kind of confused expression people get when their perfectly ordered world suddenly develops an unexpected crack. "Ma'am," Officer Mills said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent restaurant. "Are you Camille Lane?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and I could imagine Camille's mind racing to process what was happening. Her name, spoken by a police officer, in front of all these people, in the middle of her very important lunch with her very important friend. The color started draining from her face as the implications began to sink in. "Yes," she managed, her voice smaller than usual, lacking the confident tone she used when discussing art installations or the deeper meaning of whatever pretentious novel Damien had recommended that week. What's wrong?" Officer Mills consulted her notepad with the kind of professional detachment that comes from delivering bad news, so often it becomes routine. "Your husband, Marcus Lane, was involved in a major vehicle accident earlier this afternoon. He was transported by ambulance to St. Jude's Hospital with significant injuries. We've been trying to contact you for over 2 hours. He listed you as his emergency contact." The words hit the restaurant like a physical force. I could imagine the collective gasp from the other diners, the way conversations at nearby tables would resume in urgent whispers, the way people would lean forward slightly to make sure they didn't miss any of this unexpected entertainment. Damien's reaction was particularly satisfying to imagine, his carefully cultivated image of sophisticated worldliness cracking like cheap paint as he realized he was suddenly part of a very real, very serious situation that couldn't be solved with wine pairings or intellectual discussions. His fork finally completed its journey to the table, forgotten as he stared at the officers with the expression of someone who'd just realized the world contained problems that trust funds couldn't fix. "Significant injuries?" Camille repeated, and I could picture her voice cracking slightly on the words. The woman who'd texted, "Ugh, that sucks," was now faced with the reality of what that actually meant, delivered by uniformed officers in front of a room full of witnesses who were hanging on every word. Officer Mills continued with the kind of professional thoroughness that Ronan had undoubtedly requested. He suffered a broken arm and concussion when another vehicle ran a red light and struck his car. The accident occurred at approximately 11:47 p.m. He's currently stable at St. Jude's Emergency Department. The silence in the restaurant was so complete you could have heard a pin drop, except for the soft jazz music still playing through the speakers, an absurdly cheerful soundtrack to what was rapidly becoming the most uncomfortable lunch of Camille's life. "We've been attempting to reach you since the accident occurred," Officer Chen added, his tone carrying just a hint of reproach that suggested he'd been briefed on exactly how long they'd been trying to contact the victim's wife. "Multiple calls to your listed number went unanswered." I could imagine Camille's phone, sitting silent in her purse while she focused on more important things like Damien's thoughts on postmodern literature or whatever philosophical garbage they'd been discussing while her husband lay bleeding in a hospital bed. He specifically asked us to notify you in person," Officer Mills concluded, and those words were probably the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, even though I wasn't there to witness their impact firsthand. The officer's tone was perfectly neutral, completely professional, but somehow managed to carry an undertone that suggested exactly what she thought about a wife who couldn't be reached when her husband was fighting for his life. It was the kind of subtle judgment that only comes from years of dealing with people's priorities and finding them wanting. "You'll also need to coordinate with the towing company regarding personal effects from the vehicle," Officer Chen added, consulting his own notes. "The car was declared a total loss at the scene. Here's the information for the impound lot." He handed her a business card, and I could imagine her taking it with shaking hands, still trying to process the fact that her husband's car, and nearly her husband, had been destroyed while she was discussing the artistic merit of overpriced appetizers. "That's all the information we have at this time, ma'am," Officer Mills said, closing her notepad with a decisive snap that probably echoed through the silent restaurant like a gunshot. "We strongly suggest you proceed to the hospital immediately." And then, with the same professional efficiency they'd used to enter, both officers turned and walked toward the door, their job complete, leaving behind a dining room full of people who'd just witnessed someone's carefully constructed world collapse in real time. I could imagine Camille sitting there in the aftermath, surrounded by the scattered remains of her sophisticated lunch and the weight of dozens of stares from strangers who now knew exactly what kind of person she was. Her perfectly planned afternoon, her important conversation with Damien, her entire self-image as someone who had her priorities straight. All of it reduced to rubble by a simple police notification that she should have received hours ago in the privacy of a phone call. But she'd chosen differently, and now everyone in that restaurant knew it. Back at St. Jude's, I was getting the full VIP treatment. If VIP stood for a very injured person instead of very important person. Dr. Walsh had just finished explaining the thrilling details of my medical situation, while a nurse who looked like she could bench press a small car carefully maneuvered my busted arm into what would become my stylish new accessory for the next 6 to 8 weeks. The cast was going to be that lovely hospital beige color that screamed, I made poor life choices. But hey, at least it would match my current mood. The stitches were the fun part. Apparently, when glass decides to redecorate your face, it likes to get creative with the patterns. Nothing too dramatic, just a few artistic slashes that would probably leave me looking like I'd gotten into a fight with a very small but very determined ninja. The doctor assured me they'd heal up fine and barely leave scars, which was great news for my already devastated modeling career. I was lying there contemplating the acoustic tiles and the ceiling and wondering if there was some kind of cosmic joke being played at my expense when I heard a familiar voice cutting through the usual hospital chaos like a machete through bureaucratic bullshit. Where is he? Where's my idiot brother? Tessa, my younger sister, the human hurricane who could turn a library into a war zone just by walking through the doors. I heard her before I saw her, which was usually the case with Tess. She had a voice that could cut through steel and a personality to match. The sound of her approach was like hearing the cavalry charge, if the cavalry wore designer boots and had a master's degree in corporate warfare. She appeared in my doorway looking exactly like what she was, a successful marketing executive who'd just abandoned whatever important meeting she'd been in to rush to the hospital. Her blonde hair was still perfectly styled despite the obvious speed with which she'd gotten here, and she was wearing one of those power suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Tessa had always been the sibling who landed on her feet, the one who turned every setback into a comeback story and every obstacle into a stepping stone. But right now, she looked like she was ready to burn down half the city to get to whoever had hurt her big brother. Jesus Christ, Marcus, she said, taking in the full scope of my condition with the kind of clinical assessment that came from years of dealing with crisis management in the corporate world. You look like you got hit by a truck. Close. I managed, holding up my phone to show her the text exchange that had become the centerpiece of my evening's entertainment. Honda Civic. But check this out. This is the real injury. Tessa took my phone and read through the messages, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief to what I could only describe as controlled nuclear fury. She read it once, then again, then a third time like she was making absolutely sure she hadn't misunderstood something fundamental about human decency. Are you fucking kidding me? She said, and I was pretty sure the nurse 3 rooms over could hear her. She said, ugh, that sucks about her husband being in a car accident. Don't forget the part where she suggested I take a cab home from the emergency room. I added helpfully. That was my personal favorite touch. Tessa stared at the phone screen for another long moment, and I could practically see the gears turning in her head. My sister didn't just get angry, she got strategic. When Tessa decided someone needed to be dealt with, she approached it like a military campaign, complete with tactical planning and precision execution. Oh, we're done, she said finally, handing me back my phone with the kind of careful control that suggested she was fighting the urge to throw it against the wall. We are so fucking done with this bullshit. I asked, though I had a pretty good idea where this was heading. Marcus, I've been watching you make excuses for that woman for 6 years, Tessa said, pulling up the visitor's chair with more force than strictly necessary. 6 years of watching her treat you like an inconvenience, like some kind of backup plan she keeps around for when her real life gets boring. And now this. She gestured at my cast, my stitched-up face, the general disaster that had become my evening. Your husband is lying in a hospital bed, and her biggest concern is that it might interrupt her lunch date with Captain Trust Fund? No, absolutely not. This ends tonight. The thing about Tessa was that when she made a decision, it wasn't really a suggestion or a proposal. It was more like a natural law that the universe just had to adjust to accommodate. She'd been that way since we were kids, the little sister who somehow ended up being the one calling the shots by sheer force of will and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than what she considered acceptable. I'll take you home, she continued, already pulling out her own phone and scrolling through her contacts like a general reviewing her available troops. But first, we're going to deal with Camille. Permanently. Tess, I started, but she held up a hand that could have stopped traffic. No, she said firmly. No more, but she's my wife, or, but I love her, or any of that bullshit. She just showed you exactly who she is and exactly how much you matter to her. When someone tells you who they are, Marcus, you listen. She was right, of course. Tessa was almost always right about people, which was probably why she'd been so successful climbing the corporate ladder while I'd been content to spend my days patching up other people's mistakes. She had this ability to cut through all the noise and see people for exactly what they were, without the rose-colored glasses that the rest of us use to make reality more palatable. Besides, she added, her voice taking on that particular tone that meant she'd already started planning whatever came next. This isn't just about tonight. This is about all the nights, all the times she's chosen something or someone else over you, all the ways she's made you feel like you should be grateful for whatever scraps of attention she felt like throwing your way. I thought about that for a moment, letting the truth of it settle in my chest next to all the other uncomfortable realizations this night had brought. Tessa wasn't wrong. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the most obvious example of a pattern that had been going on for years. All those times Camille had been too busy, too tired, too focused on her own priorities to make space for mine. All those moments when I told myself that this was just how marriage worked, that compromise meant accepting less than what you actually needed. So what are you suggesting? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Tessa's smile was the kind that had probably sent shivers down the spines of countless corporate executives who'd underestimated her over the years. It was the smile of someone who'd just figured out how to solve a problem that everyone else thought was unsolvable. I'm suggesting we clean house, she said, scrolling through her phone with the focused intensity of someone who was already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. I'm suggesting we make sure that when Princess Camille finally decides to grace us with her presence, she finds out exactly what happens when you choose a lunch date over your husband's life. The machines kept beeping their steady rhythm around us, but somehow the sound felt different now, less like medical equipment monitoring a patient and more like a countdown timer marking the end of something that had been broken for longer than I'd been willing to admit. We're going to clear her out of your life, Tessa said with the kind of finality that suggested the decision had already been made and the rest was just logistics. Completely. Permanently. And we're going to do it right. And looking at my sister's face, seeing the determination there that I'd watched her use to bulldoze through every obstacle life had thrown her way, I realized that for the first time in years, I actually believed that things were about to change. The beautiful thing about pain medication is that it doesn't just dull physical pain. It also provides this lovely buffer between you and the emotional train wreck that your life has suddenly become. So when my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp trapped in a jar, I was able to watch the incoming messages from Camille with the kind of detached fascination usually reserved for nature documentaries about predators in their natural habitat. The first text came through while Tessa was still in full battle planning mode, scrolling through her contacts and muttering things that would have made a sailor blush. My phone lit up with Camille's name, and I have to admit, there was a moment where some pathetic part of me thought maybe, just maybe, she was calling to apologize, to explain, to somehow make this whole disaster make sense. I should have known better. I'm on my way. I didn't know it was that serious. That was message number 1, and already I could feel my blood pressure rising despite the pharmaceutical cocktail keeping me artificially calm. She didn't know it was that serious? I'd literally told her I was in the emergency room with a broken arm. What part of emergency room and broken arm suggested a minor inconvenience that could wait until after dessert and coffee? But wait, there was more. Because apparently, when Camille was on a roll, she really committed to the performance. Why didn't you call more than once? And there it was, the classic deflection move that I'd seen her pull countless times over the years. Something goes wrong, and somehow it becomes someone else's fault. Never mind that she'd ignored 3 calls from the hospital while her husband was being cut out of a mangled car. Never mind that any normal human being would have answered their phone when the hospital kept calling. No, the real problem was that I hadn't tried hard enough to reach her. Tessa looked up from her phone when she heard me make that particular sound that's somewhere between a laugh and a growl. "What now?" she asked, though her expression suggested she already knew this wasn't going to be good news. I showed her the messages, watching her face cycle through the same progression of emotions I'd just experienced: confusion, disbelief, and finally, the kind of cold fury that made me glad we were related instead of enemies. "Oh, this bitch has some serious balls," Tessa said, and I was pretty sure the elderly patient in the next bed could hear her through the thin walls. "She's actually trying to make this your fault?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed again. Message number 3 in what was rapidly becoming a masterclass in how not to respond when your spouse nearly dies in a car accident. "Did you seriously send cops to embarrass me? That was cruel, Marcus." I stared at that message for a long moment, feeling something shift inside my chest that had nothing to do with the accident and everything to do with the slow, dawning realization that I was married to someone who was genuinely, spectacularly selfish. Not just inconsiderate or thoughtless. Actually, fundamentally incapable of seeing beyond her own immediate needs and wants. She was embarrassed. Her husband was lying in a hospital bed, and her primary concern was that she'd been embarrassed in front of her trust fund boyfriend and a restaurant full of strangers who now knew exactly what kind of person she was. The fact that those cops had been sent because she'd ignored multiple calls from the hospital while her husband fought for his life? Totally irrelevant. The real victim here was Camille and her wounded pride. "Let me guess," Tessa said, reading over my shoulder. "She's mad that you made her look bad?" "Gets better," I said, because apparently my phone wasn't done delivering this evening's entertainment. Message number 4 arrived like the grand finale of a fireworks show. If fireworks shows were designed to demonstrate the absolute worst of human nature. "This is your fault." 3 words. 3 simple, beautiful words that somehow managed to encapsulate everything wrong with my marriage and everything I'd been too stupid or too stubborn to see for the past 6 years. All of this, was my fault. The accident was my fault, presumably because I'd had the audacity to drive home from work. The hospital visit was my fault, probably because I should have been more careful about getting T-boned by teenagers with more horsepower than brain cells. The police notification was my fault, because I should have somehow known that my wife would be too busy discussing postmodern art to answer her phone when the hospital called. Hell, knowing Camille, my broken arm was probably my fault too, because I should have been tougher or more resilient or better at predicting when drunk kids were going to run red lights. Tessa read that last message and went very, very quiet. In my experience, when my sister went quiet, it usually meant someone was about to have a very bad day, and that someone was typically whoever had been stupid enough to piss her off. "Marcus," she said, her voice carrying the kind of deadly calm that corporate executives probably heard right before they got fired. I need you to listen to me very carefully. Are you listening? I'm listening, I said, though honestly, the pain meds were making everything feel like it was happening underwater. I want you to block her number. Right now? Before she sends any more of this toxic bullshit your way. I looked down at my phone, at the string of messages that read like a textbook example of emotional manipulation and victim blaming. Part of me, the part that had been making excuses for Camille's behavior for years, wanted to argue. Wanted to say that she was probably just panicked, that people said stupid things when they were scared, that maybe if I just gave her a chance to explain, this would all make sense somehow. But the rest of me, the part that was finally starting to wake up after years of sleepwalking through my own life, knew better. This wasn't panic. This wasn't fear. This was Camille showing me exactly who she was when the chips were down, when something actually mattered, when she had to choose between her own convenience and her husband's well-being. And she'd chosen convenience. She'd chosen Damien and his philosophical bullshit and her precious lunch over the man she'd promised to love and honor and all that other stuff that apparently only applied when it was convenient for her social calendar. You know what? I said, scrolling through my phone's settings with my good hand. You're absolutely right. I found her contact information and hit the magic button that would send any future communications from my loving wife straight into the digital void where they belonged. Block contact. Are you sure? Yes, I was sure. More sure than I'd been about anything in a very long time. The screen confirmed the action with a little notification that somehow felt more satisfying than any of the pain medication they'd been pumping into my system. Camille Lane, contact blocked. 3 beautiful words that felt like the first honest thing that had happened all day. There, I said, showing Tessa the screen. Done. She smiled. Not the corporate shark smile from earlier, but something warmer, prouder. Good. Now, what do you say we make sure she gets the message loud and clear? I looked at my sister, this force of nature who'd dropped everything to rush to my side when I needed her, who'd seen through Camille's bullshit years before I'd been ready to admit it existed, who was now ready to go to war on my behalf without asking for anything in return. What did you have in mind? I asked. Tessa's smile widened, and I realized that blocking Camille's number was just the opening move in whatever game my sister was about to play. And judging by the look in her eyes, it was going to be a game that Camille was completely unprepared for. Oh, Marcus, she said, already dialing someone on her own phone. You're going to love this. We're going to clean house, and we're going to do it right. The thing about Tessa is that when she decides to solve a problem, she doesn't just solve it. She completely annihilates it from existence and then builds something better in its place. Watching her work was like watching a master craftsman. If master craftsmen specialized in the complete and total dismantling of toxic relationships with military precision and a smile that could cut glass. She'd already been on her phone for 20 minutes, making calls with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years managing corporate crises and hostile takeovers. Each conversation was brief, professional, and absolutely devastating in its implications for anyone who might be on the receiving end of Tessa's particular brand of problem solving. Morgan Movers, she said, covering the phone and grinning at me like a cat who'd just figured out how to open the canary cage. They specialize in what they call relationship transition services. Basically, they're the Navy SEALs of breakup logistics. I had to admire the entrepreneurial spirit of whoever had figured out there was money to be made in helping people extract themselves from bad relationships. It was like divorce court, but with better customer service and probably fewer lawyers involved. Though knowing Tessa, she'd probably already thought of that angle too. Hi, this is Tessa Lane calling for my brother Marcus, she said into the phone, her voice taking on that particular tone she used when she was about to charm someone into doing exactly what she wanted. We need a complete pack-out and removal service for tomorrow morning. 1-bedroom apartment, downtown. Everything belonging to one specific person needs to be boxed, labeled, and ready for pickup. She paused, listening to whoever was on the other end. Probably some poor customer service rep who had no idea they were about to become part of Tessa's campaign to reshape my entire life. No, he won't be present during the packing, she continued, and I could practically hear the satisfaction in her voice. We'll provide a detailed list of items and photographs for identification. Yes, this is a standard relationship dissolution. Very standard. The way she said very standard made it sound like failed marriages were just another item on her to-do list, somewhere between quarterly budget reviews and strategic planning meetings. Which, knowing my sister, they probably were. While she handled the logistics of Operation Remove Camille from my life, I found myself thinking about all the stuff that was scattered around my apartment. 6 years of accumulated couple debris. Her expensive skincare products taking up half the bathroom counter. Her collection of scented candles that apparently served some mysterious purpose beyond making the place smell like a Yankee Candle store had exploded. And that god-awful modern art piece she'd insisted on hanging in the living room that looked like someone had sneezed paint onto a canvas and called it evocative. The clothes alone would probably take hours to sort through. Camille had this thing about designer labels and investment pieces that cost more than my monthly salary. Her closet looked like a boutique that catered exclusively to people who thought spending $300 on a t-shirt was a reasonable life choice. Not that I was bitter or anything. Excellent, Tessa was saying, apparently having worked out whatever details needed working out. We'll need everything boxed, labeled, and staged in the living room by noon tomorrow. Clean, professional, no damage to any items. This is about boundaries, not revenge. She hung up and immediately started dialing another number, because apparently we were just getting started with the wholesale reorganization of my personal life. Loctite Locksmiths, she announced, giving me a thumbs up like she'd just scored the winning goal in whatever game we were playing. Can't have Princess Camille letting herself back in whenever she feels like it. The locksmith conversation was even shorter than the moving company call, probably because changing locks was significantly less complicated than coordinating the complete removal of someone's entire existence from an apartment. Though in Tessa's hands, both seemed to be getting handled with the same ruthless efficiency. Tomorrow at 8 a.m., she said after hanging up. New locks, new keys, and a security system upgrade, because why not go all the way, right? I had to laugh at that, despite everything. My sister didn't just solve problems. She oversolved them, adding features and benefits that you didn't even know you needed until she pointed them out. It was probably why she'd been so successful in the corporate world, where the ability to anticipate problems 3 steps ahead was worth its weight in quarterly bonuses. Now comes the fun part, she said, cracking her knuckles like a pianist preparing for a complicated concerto. The official notification. She opened her laptop, because of course Tessa traveled with a laptop, probably had a full mobile office setup in whatever ridiculously expensive car she'd driven over here, and started typing with the kind of focused intensity that usually preceded corporate bloodbaths. What are you writing? I asked, though I suspected I already knew this wasn't going to be your typical "it's not you, it's me" breakup email. A masterpiece, she said without looking up from the screen. Professional, clear, legally sound, and absolutely devastating in its politeness. I watched her type, occasionally pausing to consider word choices or restructure sentences, crafting what I could only assume was going to be the most politely brutal eviction notice in the history of failed relationships. Every few seconds, she'd smile to herself, apparently pleased with whatever literary devastation she was creating. Read this, she said finally, turning the laptop toward me. Subject: Retrieval of personal property, ***. From Tessa Lane, ***. Camille, your relationship and residence with Marcus Lane have been terminated effective immediately. Following your response to his medical emergency this afternoon, it has become clear that this living arrangement is no longer sustainable or appropriate. Your personal belongings have been professionally packed and inventoried by Morgan Movers and are ready for retrieval. You have 48 hours from the time of this email to coordinate pickup with the moving company. Their contact information is attached. Please note that the locks have been changed as a security precaution. Any future access to the property will require advance coordination through the moving company or legal counsel. Any attempt to contact Marcus directly will be considered harassment and will be documented accordingly. All future communication regarding this matter should be directed through my office. Tessa Lane, on behalf of Marcus Lane. I read it twice, marveling at how Tessa had managed to make a breakup sound like a corporate merger gone wrong. It was polite, professional, and absolutely devastating in its complete lack of emotion or room for negotiation. There was no "let's talk about this," or "maybe we can work things out," just cold, hard logistics, and a clear timeline for removing yourself from someone's life. Jesus, Tess, I said, genuinely impressed. This reads like you're terminating a business contract. Because that's exactly what I'm doing, she replied, already moving the cursor to the send button. Camille treated your marriage like a business arrangement where she got all the benefits and none of the responsibilities. So now she gets to experience the business end of that arrangement. The email disappeared with a soft whoosh, carrying with it the official end of my 6-year marriage and the beginning of whatever came next. I watched the sent confirmation appear on the screen and felt something shift in my chest. Not sadness, exactly, but more like relief. Like I'd been holding my breath for years and was finally allowed to exhale. There, Tessa said, closing the laptop with a decisive snap. Clean, professional, and completely final. By Thursday morning, it'll be like she was never there. I looked around the hospital room, at the machines beeping steadily beside my bed, at my sister who dropped everything to come wage war on my behalf, at the cast on my arm that was somehow the least broken thing about my life right now. You know what the weird part is? I said, "What's that?" For the first time in years, I actually feel like I can breathe. That night, after Tessa had finally gone home with promises to check on me first thing in the morning and threats to personally hunt down anyone who gave me grief about my situation, I was lying in my own bed for the first time in what felt like a decade. The apartment was weird without Camille's presence, not emptier exactly. More like when you finally turn off a TV that's been playing background noise for so long you forgot it was there. The silence wasn't lonely, it was peaceful. The pain meds were wearing off enough that I could think clearly, but not so much that my arm felt like it was trying to secede from the rest of my body. I was scrolling through Netflix with my good hand, looking for something mindless to fall asleep to, when my phone buzzed with a notification that made me do a double take. Instagram message request. From Damian Price. I stared at the notification for a solid 30 seconds, trying to process what possible reason Captain Trust Fund could have for sliding into my DMs. This was the same guy who'd been having his very important lunch with my wife while I was bleeding in a hospital bed. The same guy who probably thought emergency contact was something you called when you ran out of champagne at a dinner party. Curiosity won out over common sense, a pattern that had gotten me into trouble before, but never quite like this. I opened the message, not sure if I was about to read an apology, a confession, or just more evidence that the entire universe had lost its collective mind. Hey man, I didn't know about your accident. When the cops came, I was shocked. I asked Camille why she hadn't left earlier. She just shrugged. That's not the kind of person I want in my life. I'm sorry for being part of this mess. Hope you recover fast. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time because apparently this night was just going to keep delivering surprises until my brain completely gave up trying to process them. Damian Price. The guy I'd spent years assuming was trying to steal my wife, the trust fund philosopher who quoted dead Germans at dinner parties and wore scarves in July, was apologizing to me. And not just apologizing, but essentially confirming that Camille was exactly as awful as her behavior suggested. The really fascinating part was that detail about him asking why she hadn't left earlier and her response being a shrug. A fucking shrug. Her husband was in the hospital, and when her supposed best friend suggested maybe she should go check on him, she shrugged like he'd asked her opinion about the weather. I could picture the scene. Damian probably doing that thing rich people do when they're confronted with actual human suffering. That uncomfortable shifting around while they try to figure out how to respond appropriately. And Camille, faced with the choice between appearing caring and admitting that she'd rather finish her meal than deal with her husband's medical emergency, just shrugged. It was almost impressive in its complete lack of self-awareness. Most people, when caught being heartless in front of witnesses, at least had the decency to pretend they cared. But not Camille. She was apparently so committed to her own priorities that she couldn't even fake concern when social pressure demanded it. The fact that Damian, Mr. Pretentious Philosophy himself, was horrified enough by her reaction to reach out to me spoke volumes about just how badly she'd handled the situation. This was a guy who probably thought empathy was a wine varietal, and even he could see that something was fundamentally wrong with a woman who couldn't be bothered to show concern for her injured spouse. That's not the kind of person I want in my life. Coming from Damian, that was practically a character assassination. He was essentially saying that Camille had failed some basic test of human decency so spectacularly that even someone who spent his days discussing the deeper meaning of abstract art couldn't overlook it. I found myself laughing, not the bitter, angry kind of laugh I'd been doing all day, but something closer to genuine amusement. The irony was just too perfect. I'd spent years being jealous of Damien, worried that he was going to steal my wife away with his sophisticated conversation and his designer lifestyle. Turns out, he had better judgment about people than I did. The message was weak, sure. It was the kind of apology that rich people give when they want to distance themselves from someone else's bad behavior without actually taking any real responsibility. But it was also revealing in ways that Damien probably didn't realize. He'd been there. He'd seen Camille's reaction firsthand. And whatever he'd witnessed had been so off-putting that he'd felt compelled to reach out to the husband he barely knew to essentially say, "Holy shit, your wife is terrible, and I want no part of this." More importantly, it meant that Camille hadn't just lost her husband tonight. She'd also lost her backup plan, her safety net, her best friend, who'd been providing her with the intellectual stimulation and sophisticated companionship that apparently I was too blue-collar to offer. Damien Price, with his trust fund and his philosophical pretensions and his carefully curated lifestyle, had looked at Camille's behavior and decided she wasn't worth keeping around. The guy who probably had women throwing themselves at him left and right had seen enough of my wife's true character in one afternoon to know he wanted nothing to do with her. That was the most damning indictment of all. Not the blocked phone calls, not the dismissive text messages, not even the shrug when asked why she wasn't rushing to her husband's bedside. The real truth about Camille was that even the people she thought were her allies, the ones she'd prioritized over her marriage, found her behavior unacceptable when it really mattered. I thought about responding to Damien's message, maybe thanking him for the information or asking for more details about exactly what had happened at that restaurant. But honestly, what was the point? The damage was done, the truth was out, and adding more drama to this shit show wasn't going to change anything. Instead, I just deleted the message request and went back to browsing Netflix. Damien could keep his weak apology and his guilty conscience. I had more important things to think about, like what I was going to do with all the extra closet space I was about to have. The apartment felt different now, not just quiet, but somehow cleaner. Like someone had opened all the windows and let out years of accumulated toxicity. Tomorrow, Morgan movers would come and physically remove the last traces of Camille from my space. But tonight, just knowing that even her precious Damien had seen through her bullshit was enough. I settled on some mindless action movie and closed my eyes, my phone silent beside me for the first time in longer than I could remember. No more texts from Camille, no more guilt trips or blame games or carefully worded manipulations designed to make me question my own judgment. Just silence, and the steady sound of my own breathing, and the comfortable weight of knowing that sometimes the trash takes itself out. The next morning came with the kind of efficiency that only happens when Tessa is running the show. By 8 a.m. sharp, Loctite locksmiths had already come and gone, leaving me with a set of shiny new keys and the satisfying knowledge that my apartment was now officially a Camille-free zone. The security system upgrade was overkill, but I had to admit there was something deeply satisfying about having a digital fortress protecting my newfound peace of mind. Morgan movers arrived at exactly 9 a.m. with the kind of professional cheerfulness that suggested they'd done this dance many times before. The team leader, a compact woman named Rosa who looked like she could bench press a piano, took one look around my apartment and nodded with the satisfaction of someone who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. "Standard relationship dissolution," she said, consulting her tablet like she was reading a grocery list. "We've got the inventory list your sister provided, photos for identification, and instructions to treat everything with care regardless of personal feelings about the situation." I had to respect the professionalism. These people had turned heartbreak into a business model, and judging by their efficiency, business was probably pretty good. Rosa and her team moved through my apartment like surgical technicians, carefully identifying and boxing everything that belonged to Camille with the kind of methodical precision that would have impressed an accountant. Watching strangers pack up 6 years of someone else's life was surreal in a way that I hadn't expected. They handled Camille's expensive skincare products like they were defusing bombs, wrapped her designer clothes in tissue paper, like they were museum artifacts, and carefully bubble-wrapped that god-awful modern art piece that had been haunting my living room wall for the past 3 years. "This piece here," Rosa said, gesturing at the painting that looked like someone had sneezed rainbow colors onto a canvas. "The notes say it's valued at $15,000. "That's what she paid for it," I confirmed, trying not to sound bitter about the fact that my wife had spent more on one piece of abstract nonsense than I made in 2 months. "It's supposed to represent the fluidity of emotional expression or some shit like that." Rosa nodded with the kind of professional neutrality that suggested she'd heard worse explanations for expensive art. "We'll treat it accordingly," she said, which I assumed meant they'd wrap it up carefully instead of using it as a frisbee, though honestly, either option would have been fine with me. The whole process took about 3 hours, during which time my apartment was gradually transformed from the cluttered shrine to someone else's taste into something that actually looked like a place where I might want to live. It was amazing how much space opened up once you removed all the unnecessary shit that someone else had insisted was essential for proper living. The scented candles alone filled 2 entire boxes, which raised the question of exactly how many different ways a person needed their living space to smell like a Bath and Body Works had exploded. Her shoe collection required its own dedicated moving cart, because apparently you needed 47 pairs of shoes to properly express your personality, even if 30 of them were identical black heels in slightly different shades. By noon, everything was boxed, labeled, and stacked in my living room like the world's most depressing game of Tetris. Rosa handed me a detailed inventory list and a receipt, her expression suggesting this was just another Tuesday in the relationship cleanup business. "Your sister arranged for storage if pickup doesn't happen within the 48-hour window," she said, checking something off on her tablet. "After that, it's not your problem anymore. Not my problem anymore." For words that somehow managed to capture the entire spirit of this whole operation. For 6 years, Camille's problems had been my problems. Her priorities had dictated my schedule. Her moods had determined the atmosphere of my home. And now, with the stroke of a pen and the efficiency of professional movers, none of that was my problem anymore. I was admiring the newly spacious living room when the buzzer rang at exactly 2:17 p.m. The security camera showed a sleek black Mercedes parked outside, the kind of car that screamed, "I have money and I want everyone to know it." Camille's father's car. Mr. Howard Blythe stepped out of the driver's seat looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Howard was old-school corporate elite, the kind of guy who wore 3-piece suits to barbecues and thought casual Friday meant removing his cufflinks. He'd always been polite to me in that stiff, formal way that rich people use when they're talking to someone they consider beneath their social station but can't quite dismiss entirely. For 6 years, he'd called me the steady rock whenever anyone asked about his daughter's husband. Not Marcus or my son-in-law, but the steady rock. Like I was some kind of geological formation that existed primarily to provide stability for his precious daughter's more interesting life. It was a backhanded compliment wrapped in the kind of condescending approval that rich people mistake for genuine affection. Camille got out of the passenger side, and I had to admit she looked like hell. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled. Her usually flawless makeup was smudged around the edges, and she was wearing yesterday's clothes like she'd slept in them. Which, knowing Camille's obsession with her appearance, meant she was either having a complete breakdown or had completely given up pretending she had her shit together. She didn't look up at the security camera, didn't try to ring the buzzer, didn't make any attempt to communicate. Just stood there staring at the building like it was some kind of fortress that had suddenly become impenetrable, which I guess it had. Through the intercom, I could hear Howard talking to someone. Probably coordinating with the moving company on his phone, because even in family crisis mode, he was still the kind of guy who delegated everything to other people. Camille stood next to him like a ghost of herself, and for just a moment, I felt something that might have been pity. But then I remembered her text messages from yesterday, her shrug when Damien suggested she should check on her injured husband, the casual way she'd suggested I take a cab home from the emergency room. The pity evaporated pretty quickly after that. The movers worked with the same professional efficiency they'd shown earlier, loading box after box into the Mercedes with the kind of careful attention that suggested Howard was paying them well to make this as painless as possible. Camille supervised the process with the vacant expression of someone who was watching their entire life get packed into cardboard containers, but she never once looked up at my windows. The whole thing took maybe 20 minutes. 20 minutes to remove 6 years of accumulated relationship debris, to pack up the physical evidence that we'd ever shared a life together, to reduce our entire marriage to a stack of boxes that could fit in the back of a luxury sedan. When they were done, Howard approached the intercom one final time. His voice crackled through the speaker with the formal politeness of someone conducting a business transaction. "Marcus, if you're listening, the items have been retrieved. Camille wanted me to tell you." He paused, and I could imagine him looking at his daughter, waiting for her to provide some final message, some last attempt at explanation or reconciliation. The silence stretched out for almost a full minute before he cleared his throat and continued. "She wanted me to tell you that she left the spare key on your kitchen counter yesterday. That was it. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to salvage anything from the wreckage of our relationship. Just a practical note about key return, delivered through her father like she was a teenager who couldn't be trusted to handle her own affairs." I watched through the window as they got back into the Mercedes and drove away, taking with them the last physical traces of Camille from my life. The car disappeared around the corner, and just like that, it was over. I walked back into my living room and looked around at the space that was now completely, undeniably mine. No designer throw pillows positioned at precise angles, no expensive candles cluttering every surface, no abstract art demanding attention from the walls. Just clean, empty space that I could fill with whatever the hell I wanted. I sat down on my couch, which was apparently mine now, since Camille hadn't tried to claim it, and took a deep breath. The apartment smelled different already, less like a showroom and more like a place where someone actually lived. For the first time in years, the silence in my apartment wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't lonely or oppressive or filled with the weight of unspoken resentments. It was just quiet, peaceful, full of possibility. I closed my eyes and smiled. Finally, peace. 7 months later, and I'm sitting in the same apartment that used to feel like a museum dedicated to someone else's taste, except now it actually looks like a place where I live. The walls have my pictures on them, shots from work, a few landscapes I took on weekend trips, even that ridiculous photo of me and my paramedic crew after we won the department's chili cook-off. Real life, not the sanitized perfection that Camille had insisted on maintaining. My arm healed up perfectly, just like Dr. Walsh said it would. The scars on my face faded to thin silver lines that most people don't even notice unless I point them out. But the real healing, the stuff that doesn't show up on X-rays, that took a little longer. Turns out, when you spend 6 years accepting less than you deserve, it takes some time to remember what you're actually worth. Work's been good. Better than good, actually. Without the constant background stress of managing someone else's emotional needs and social calendar, I've been able to focus on what I'm actually good at. Last month, I got a commendation for handling a multi-car pileup that could have been a complete disaster. Funny how much better you perform when you're not wondering if your spouse will be annoyed that you're working late again. Tessa still checks in regularly, though she's dialed back the protective sister routine. Now that she's satisfied, I'm not going to backslide into making excuses for toxic behavior. She was right about everything, of course, but she's gracious enough not to say, "I told you so," more than once a week. About 3 months ago, Camille tried reaching out. One long, exhausting email that somehow managed to hit every manipulation technique in the handbook. She was sorry. She panicked. She didn't realize how serious the accident was. Damien had pressured her to stay at lunch. Blah, blah, blah. The greatest hits of someone who'd finally figured out that actions have consequences, but still couldn't quite grasp the concept of personal responsibility. The email ended with the predictable plea, "I miss our life. I want it back. Please think about it." I read it exactly once, then did something that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. I didn't respond. Not with anger, not with explanations, not with a detailed breakdown of exactly why she was wrong about everything. I just didn't respond at all. Instead, I set up an email filter that sends anything from her address straight to the trash folder, where it belongs with the rest of the garbage I don't need cluttering up my life. The thing about revenge is that most people think it involves dramatic confrontations and elaborate schemes designed to make the other person suffer. But real revenge, the kind that actually matters, is so much simpler than that. It's silence. It's boundaries. It's waking up in a space where no one treats you like their backup plan. Camille chose rose and risotto over her husband lying in a hospital bed. She chose her social calendar over basic human decency, her trust fund philosopher over the man who'd spent 6 years trying to make her happy. Those were her choices, and now she gets to live with the consequences of them. I chose differently. I chose peace over drama, self-respect over settlement, silence over endless explanations that would never be enough anyway. The apartment is quiet these days, but it's a good kind of quiet. The kind that comes from knowing you don't have to walk on eggshells or manage someone else's moods or pretend that selfish behavior is just a quirky personality trait. I wake up when I want to wake up, eat what I want to eat, watch whatever garbage I feel like watching on TV without having to endure commentary about how my entertainment choices reflect poorly on my intellectual development. Sometimes I run into people who knew us as a couple, and they ask about Camille with that careful tone people use when they're fishing for gossip. I just tell them we're not together anymore and change the subject. No drama, no detailed explanations, no bitter rants about her character flaws. Just a simple statement of fact and a firm redirect to literally anything else. I erased her from my story completely, and I'm writing a better one now. One where the protagonist doesn't accept crumbs and call it a feast, where the hero actually values himself enough to demand better treatment, where the ending involves peace instead of chaos. It's a good story, and for the first time in years, I'm looking forward to seeing how it turns out. I still remember the exact moment my stomach dropped. It was a quiet Thursday evening. Nothing dramatic. No storm clouds outside. Just the clinking of silverware and the hum of the kitchen fan. I was folding napkins at the dinner table, helping my wife Adeline get ready for what I believed was her brother Mason's wedding the next day. I had ironed my shirt earlier that afternoon. Even polished the old shoes I only wear to events that require smiling through small talk. You excited for tomorrow? I asked, gently tucking a napkin into a rose shape. Adeline blinked, almost like she didn't understand what I was talking about. Then she tilted her head slightly, narrowed her eyes at me as if I had just suggested the sky was green, and replied in the flattest voice I've ever heard from her. It was last week. At first, I thought she was joking. I waited for the smirk, the sarcastic jab she always followed her pranks with. But nothing came. She reached for her phone, tapped her screen a few times, and handed it to me without a word. There it was. Proof. Mason and his bride, Lucy, standing under a wooden arch decorated with white roses and soft string lights. Guests gathered by the lake, raising glasses. There was Mason's best man, her cousin Jace, wiping tears from his eyes. The photographer had done a great job capturing everything. And then there was Adeline, my wife, in a deep emerald dress I'd never seen before. Hair curled, makeup perfect, smiling like she belonged there. Because she did. Everyone did. Except me. I kept flipping through the pictures, searching for a glimpse of myself. Maybe a corner of my jacket in the background. Maybe I'd forgotten I was there. Maybe they were testing me for some reason I didn't understand. But I wasn't in a single one. I set the phone down slowly. My throat felt dry. I looked at her, still waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, anything human. She just went back to folding napkins, humming like nothing happened. From the couch, her sister Mira called out, "Didn't we tell you?" She said it casually, like someone mentioning the weather. I turned my head and found her scrolling through her own phone, legs crossed, sipping from a glass of red wine like we were all just sitting through another boring commercial break. Their mother Delphine was beside her. She laughed, a full-bodied, deep laugh that made her shoulders shake. "Oh goodness, I could have sworn we told you," she wheezed, wiping her eyes with a tissue she pulled from her sleeve. No one said sorry. No one even looked concerned. They acted like I was the forgetful one. Like it was my fault for not magically appearing at a wedding I was never told about. I stood there, napkin in hand, feeling like the floor had dropped from under me. Everything else faded, the hum of the fan, the clink of the wine glass, even the rising tension in my jaw. It was just me and the realization that I had become a stranger in my own house. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. And it hit loud and clear. I didn't matter to them. Not enough to be told. Not enough to be missed. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. I just quietly picked up the plates from the table and started placing them in the sink. My hands moved automatically, scrubbing bits of rice and sauce while my mind stayed stuck on that photo, Adeline, smiling beside her brother like nothing in the world could make that moment better. Except maybe my absence. She could have told me. I'd been asking about the wedding for weeks, when it was, what the dress code would be, if I should get a gift for Mason. She always brushed it off, said the plans kept changing, said they were working things out. Lies. All of it. That night, I lay beside her in bed, our backs not touching. She scrolled through her phone until she fell asleep. Meanwhile, I stared at the ceiling, numb. Not sad. Not even angry. Just empty. I replayed the last few months in my mind. How often her family made plans without me. How I was left out of group texts. How they scheduled dinners that must have slipped their minds when I asked. How Mira once made a joke about me being the plus one that got subtracted. How I laughed. I actually laughed. Now I knew better. This wasn't carelessness. It was deliberate. I had been erased. What stung most wasn't even the betrayal. It was the calmness with which they did it. Like it was routine. Like they had done it before. Like I was the only one who hadn't caught on. In the dark, I reached for my phone. I opened the photo again. That emerald dress. That lakeside glow. Adeline smiling without me. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand. And that's when something in me clicked. Not in a loud, vengeful way, but in a cold, quiet whisper deep in my chest. They thought I'd stay quiet. They thought I'd keep folding napkins. They had no idea. That night, sleep didn't visit me. Not even a hint of it. I lay still beside Adeline, who had fallen asleep without a shred of guilt on her face. Her breathing was soft and even, like someone who had nothing to worry about in the world. Meanwhile, I was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind circling the same question again and again. How long have I been invisible in this family? I turned to my side, quietly picked up my phone, and opened the gallery where I had saved the wedding photos from her screen. I zoomed in on each one, examining faces, body language, laughter. Everyone looked happy. Posed. Included. Except me. I wasn't there, not in any shot, not in any corner of a reflection, not in a stray shadow. Because I wasn't invited. Because they had made sure I wasn't supposed to be. They didn't forget. They excluded. And it wasn't just about missing the wedding. That was just the surface. This ran deeper. Much deeper. I remembered the weeks leading up to that date, how I had helped Mason fix his new house. He'd called me about a cracked pipe under the guest bathroom, and I had called in my usual plumber. When the guy quoted him too high, I offered to cover part of it, quietly, no big scene. I just wired the difference straight to the company. Then there was the fencing issue, the kitchen tiling, the rewiring of the faulty breaker panel. I had been there every step of the way. I had done it all because family helps family. Or so I thought. Now I realized what I had really been. Useful. Not loved. Not included. Just useful. Like an app they open when needed and close the second it's done. As Adeline shifted beside me, I studied her silhouette in the dark. She looked peaceful, like someone who had just hosted a successful event. I wondered if she had smiled while they toasted her brother. I wondered if she had made a speech. Did she mention me? Did she lie and say I was away on business? Or worse, did no one ask about me at all? It made my stomach turn. By 5 a.m., I was up. I moved around the house like a ghost, quiet, invisible, familiar. I made coffee, skipped breakfast, sat at the dining table where we had once shared laughs and plans, and just stared at the empty seat across from me. Then I pulled out my laptop. It wasn't out of revenge, not yet. It was out of clarity. Cold, necessary clarity. I opened my spreadsheets. Line by line, I went through every transaction over the past 2 years. Tens of thousands had gone to Mason's renovation. More to Delphine's house repairs. A few chunks here and there toward Myra's salon launch, though that business barely lasted 3 months before folding, and no one ever mentioned returning what I gave. I never asked. I never kept score. Until now. Because now it mattered. I looked at the pattern, and a terrible realization hit me. I was more involved in their financial life than their emotional one. I wasn't family. I was infrastructure. That morning, Adeline wandered in around 7, wrapped in her robe, yawning and scratching her head. She smiled when she saw me. "Morning," she said, planting a light kiss on my cheek like nothing had happened. "Morning," I replied, my voice so calm it surprised even me. She poured herself coffee and sat opposite me. Then she started scrolling through her phone. I watched her for a moment, trying to picture what it felt like to live without consequence. To break someone's trust and then sit beside them like nothing happened. That took a kind of audacity I couldn't understand. What are you working on? She asked without looking up. Just going over a few numbers, I said. She nodded, uninterested, and moved on. I watched her take slow sips from her cup. That's when I realized something else. She didn't expect me to question anything. Not the wedding, not the photos, not even my absence from a day that any decent partner would have been part of. And that's when the quiet started hardening inside me. The kind of quiet that isn't weak. The kind that observes. That calculates. That makes a decision. I didn't confront her. I didn't shout. What good would that do? Her mother would laugh it off. Mira would roll her eyes and say I was being sensitive. Mason would shrug and pretend he had no idea. And Adeline would just blink and say something hollow like, I didn't think it mattered. I had become a ghost in my own marriage. I was present in form but erased from meaning. So, I decided I would play the part. From that day on, I moved differently. I stopped talking during dinner. She didn't seem to notice. I stopped suggesting family plans. She didn't seem to care. When her mother called and left her phone on speaker, I just listened. I took in the way Delphine referred to me like an outsider. What does he think about that? Is he going to pay for it? Tell him we'll call when we need him. They spoke about me like I wasn't in the room. So I became exactly what they treated me as, unseen. But inside, I was wide awake. I didn't know what I was planning yet. All I knew was something had shifted. Something permanent. And it wasn't about anger. It was about awareness. They had counted on me being dependable, quiet, forgiving, predictable. But that chapter had ended. They just didn't know it yet. It was a sunny Sunday when I made the mistake of driving past Myra's house. I hadn't been invited. Of course, I hadn't. But something pulled me that way. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the ache of wanting to believe that I was still part of something. Maybe just foolish habit. I don't know. What I do know is that as I slowed near her driveway, the same familiar cars were lined up out front. Myra's red coupe, Delphine's clunky SUV, Mason's new silver sedan. I recognized all of them instantly, like names on a guest list I was never added to. And through the open windows, I heard laughter. Genuine, easy laughter. I sat in my car across the street and just listened. The clinking of dishes, the sound of chairs scooting across the hardwood floor, someone turning up music on a Bluetooth speaker. Bacon. I could smell bacon from my window. I'd cooked it for them before. Mira liked hers crispy. Delphine always scolded me for burning the edges. I used to think that meant she cared. But that morning, sitting there in a car I paid for, parked near a home I helped renovate, something cracked in me. They were celebrating again. Together. And once again, I was the ghost they never spoke of. I stared at the sidewalk for a long time. People passed by walking dogs, pushing strollers. Normal life kept moving while I sat in the middle of it, paralyzed by the truth that had been growing louder with each day. They never considered me family. I was the man who paid. That's it. Myra's husband, Grant, had called me 3 months ago when their hot water heater burst. Said he didn't know who else to call. I had a guy there in an hour. Paid the bill, too, because Grant said he was waiting on a client payment and Mira was stressed. Then there was the new windows at Delphine's house. The old ones had leaks. I'd arranged the contractor and wired the deposit myself. No one thanked me. They acted like it was expected, like breathing. And I let them. I didn't want to admit that. But sitting in that car, watching Myra's front door swing open to reveal trays of food and happy people with wine glasses, I understood what I had become. I wasn't a member of their circle. I was a resource, a backup plan, a wallet that smiled. And they didn't even have the decency to pretend otherwise. I drove off in silence, passing by familiar streets, landmarks that used to make me smile, like the bench Adeline and I once sat on after our first real fight. Now, everything felt hollow. Every corner had a memory that had been edited, bleached of warmth. When I got home, I didn't go inside right away. I stood in the driveway, hands in my pockets, looking at the house I once thought of as ours. But even it had started to feel borrowed. Temporary. Like the key in my hand unlocked something I no longer had a place in. I walked through the door quietly. The living room was empty. A pile of shopping bags sat near the stairs. Adeline must have gone out with Mira the day before. Probably shopping for Mason's housewarming or something equally meaningless. I didn't ask. I didn't want to give her the opportunity to lie. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water, went into the study, and called Theo. Theo and I had been friends since college. He was a lawyer now. Sharp, precise, and more loyal than anyone I'd ever met. He'd been the best man at my wedding, though no one from Adeline's side ever really warmed up to him. Too blunt, they said. Too serious. But I'd take blunt over fake any day. Long time, he said when he picked up. Everything all right? No, I said. But it will be. He didn't press. Just waited. I told him everything. About the wedding. The laughter. The photos. About sitting outside Myra's brunch like an idiot hoping someone might call. I told him about the money, the repairs, the family that had silently cut me out while still dipping into my pockets like it was tradition. There was a long pause on his end. Then he asked, "You want out?" I didn't answer right away. I stared at the window beside me, watching a squirrel run along the fence line. "No," I said finally. "I want silence." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You don't want to confront them?" I shook my head even though he couldn't see me. They don't deserve confrontation. They'll spin it. Laugh it off. Twist my words. I just want silence. Clean, cold silence. I can do that, he said. But silence is a powerful tool. Once you go that route, you can't shout later. I don't want to shout, I replied. I want to vanish. But I want them to feel it. Theo exhaled. All right. Let's get to work then. We discussed accounts, transfers, and how to quietly untangle myself from every financial thread connecting me to the Andersons. I'd kept everything in my name or my holding company, but I'd never enforced boundaries. That was about to change. We drafted the first set of documents that night. And when I hung up, I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel grief. I felt something better. Clarity. I walked back into the living room and found Adeline on the couch, phone in hand, laughing softly at something Mira must have sent. She looked up and smiled. "You okay?" she asked, like nothing had changed. I nodded. Then I looked at her and saw a woman who believed I would always be here. A man who would always pay, always support, always stay. And in that moment, I finally understood. They didn't erase me because they hated me. They erased me because they thought I would never leave. The following Monday, Theo and I met over breakfast at a quiet little diner outside the city. It was the kind of place where nobody asked questions and everyone minded their own business. I didn't want to meet in a law office or a boardroom. I didn't want this to feel like a war, just like a decision. A correction. Theo brought a folder with him. Inside were the documents I needed to sever the quiet chains I had spent years wrapping around myself. He slid the folder across the table with his usual no-nonsense expression. "It's all here," he said, tapping the cover. "Renovation payouts, property maintenance grants, discretionary contributions, every last one of them routed through your personal holding firm. You've been a generous man." I opened it and skimmed the pages. Contracts, authorizations, amendments I had signed without thinking twice, because family needed help, because I believed helping them made me part of something. "I want it all paused," I said quietly. "Every cent, every automatic payment. I don't want a single light bulb changed unless they call me personally." Theo nodded. "I'll get the order signed today, and I've set up alerts in case they try to go around you." I sipped my coffee slowly, thinking of the look that would cross Delphine's face when the plumber said payment never came. The confusion in Myra's voice when the contractor refused to continue fixing the patio. The moment Adeline would try to spin it into another technical mix-up. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Later that afternoon, I sat at my desk in the study and began removing myself from every informal tie I had to them. I called the gardener who maintained Delphine's lawn and told him not to expect next month's payment. I emailed the property insurance rep and revoked the coverage extension I'd added for Myra's leaking ceiling. I didn't explain. I didn't make excuses. Just a line here, a cancellation there. Silent redirection. And then I waited. It took 5 days. On the 6th morning, I was having coffee on the porch when my phone buzzed. Delphine's name lit up the screen. I stared at it, let it ring until the final chime, and then picked up. I wasn't angry. I wasn't curious. I just wanted to hear how she would spin it. "Hello," I said, as calmly as if she were an old coworker calling to check in. "Oh, thank God," she sighed, in that over-the-top voice of hers. "Darling, I just got off the phone with that terrible builder. He said the kitchen work's been stopped. Something about funds not going through." I said nothing. I told him that must be a mistake, of course. "I mean, you've always handled these things. Is it a bank issue?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the wind chimes Adeline had bought 2 summers ago. They clinked softly in the breeze like they were mocking her mother's voice. "No mistake," I said plainly. A beat of silence on the other end. I'm sorry," she said. I gave a quiet chuckle and replied, "Didn't I tell you?" "What?" I repeated it slowly, gently, with the same emptiness her daughter had once offered me across our kitchen table. "Didn't I tell you?" She paused. I could hear her trying to decide whether to laugh again, whether this was some odd joke she didn't quite get yet. But I didn't wait for her to find footing. "I'll let you sort it out with Mason. Or Mira. I'm sure they've got it handled." Then I ended the call. It wasn't slamming a door. It was turning off a light. Later that day, Mira texted me. Just 2 words. "Payment issue?" I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out the folder labeled Anderson Affairs. Yes, I had finally started naming things properly. I placed their folder beside others: business accounts, real estate ventures, trusts. I looked at them all and realized something stunning. Every person in that family had benefited from me. Everyone. And not once did they treat me like I belonged. For dinner that night, Adeline made pasta. I could hear her humming while she stirred in the kitchen. She didn't ask how my day was. She didn't mention the calls. She didn't seem to know her mother had been cut off or that Mira was now pacing an H. She asked about the weekend. I said I'd be working. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The next evening, I came home to find her mother and sister sitting in the living room. Delphine stood the moment I entered, like a politician pretending to welcome an old ally. "Oh good, you're home," she said, her voice strained with something she didn't know how to hide. Fear? Confusion? Entitlement? All of it. Maybe. Mira gave me a small wave. "We thought we'd come talk in person. Sort things out." I didn't sit. I walked to the hallway table, pulled out the envelope I had prepared earlier, and handed it to Delphine. She opened it right there. Inside was a packet of itemized receipts, contractor logs, maintenance records, everything I had paid for over the past 3 years. Every leak, every wall, every nail. "This," I said, "is what humor used to cost me." Her eyes darted across the pages, realization dawning like thunder. "I didn't keep score before," I continued, "because I believed I was part of this family. I thought love was a shared thing. But it turns out it was just a tab I didn't know I'd opened." Delphine tried to speak. I didn't let her. "And now the account is closed." I turned and left the room, walked straight upstairs, and shut the door behind me. I didn't hear them leave. I didn't care. For the first time in years, the house was finally quiet. Not empty. Not tense. Just quiet. And I liked it. Adeline tried to act like nothing had happened, as if her mother and sister hadn't just sat in our living room, clutching receipts like they'd never seen accountability before, as if I hadn't just laid out the truth in black and white. She cooked dinner that night, lemon chicken with roasted potatoes. That was her peace offering meal, the one she used when she sensed tension she didn't want to talk about. But I wasn't hungry. Not for food. Not for another round of emotional amnesia. "You've barely touched your plate," she said, cutting into her chicken. "I'm not hungry," I answered without looking up. She put her fork down. "You could have told me you were cutting off the payments. You could have told me about your brother's wedding," I said quietly, still not looking at her. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. I saw it from the corner of my eye. That moment when someone considers whether lying is still worth it. But for once, she didn't deny it. She just sighed, picked up her glass of wine, and drank. "It was a misunderstanding," she murmured after a while. "It wasn't malicious. You're reading into it too much." I turned to her. "A misunderstanding is forgetting to grab milk on the way home, not erasing your husband from your brother's wedding." She flinched, and for a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, there was something close to shame in her face. But it passed quickly, replaced by that calm, practiced indifference. "You're being dramatic." There it was. The words didn't sting. Not anymore. I'd already bled dry. Now I was just walking through the ashes. "I'm moving into the guest room," I said calmly. "Starting tonight." Adeline didn't react immediately. She just stared at me like I had said I was changing the curtains. "Seriously?" she said after a moment. "You're going to sulk around the house like some ghost?" I stood up, picked up my half-full plate, and walked it to the sink. "No. I'm going to live like someone who's finally woken up." That night, I moved my clothes downstairs. The guest room was small, but it was mine. I changed the bed sheets, cleaned out the drawers, and for the first time in months, slept without the weight of pretending. The days after that were quiet. Not in the peaceful sense. More like the quiet of a battlefield after the smoke clears and everyone's waiting to see who moves first. I kept to myself. Cooked my own meals. Did my own laundry. When Adeline left for work, she stopped announcing it. When she came home, She'd glance at the guest room door like it offended her by existing. I didn't care. I was no longer interested in making her comfortable with what she had done. A week passed before she tried to press reset. One evening, I heard the clinking of glasses and the sound of her voice calling out to her mother. Apparently, they were coming over again, this time to talk things out over wine and dessert. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten to leave. I just stayed in my room, listened. Delphine opened with a joke, of course. Something dry and layered with condescension. I always knew you had a dramatic side, she said through laughter. You should have been in theater. Maybe then you'd be too busy to cut off our roof repairs. Adeline laughed with her. Mira joined in from the kitchen, chiming something about how I must be going through a midlife ego crisis. I walked out of the guest room, slow and quiet, and stepped into the hallway. None of them saw me at first. Then Delphine turned, smile still plastered on her face, until she saw what I was holding. An envelope. Another one. She rolled her eyes, still playing the role of the amused matriarch. Is this another bill breakdown, sweetheart? No, I said. This one's on the house. I walked to the coffee table and placed it down between the wine glasses. Inside were not receipts this time, but copies of emails. Screenshots of text messages. Correspondence between contractors I had paid and her family requesting extras, spa-like upgrades, fancy lighting, unnecessary additions that ballooned costs because, in Myra's words, he's good for it. This, I said evenly, is what entitlement looks like in writing. The laughter stopped. Even Mira stopped stirring her drink. Delphine opened the envelope, pulled out the pages, and went silent. I looked at Adeline. She was frozen, her hand still holding a spoon over the dessert bowl, unmoving. I didn't come out here to argue, I said. I didn't come to reclaim anything. I came to remind you that I was never invisible. You just chose to look past me. Then I turned and walked back to my room. Left them in their designer clothes, surrounded by half-eaten tiramisu and sour wine. They didn't follow. Later that night, I heard them leave. Doors closing harder than necessary. Tires screeching down the street. Adeline didn't come to the guest room. She stayed upstairs. Maybe crying. Maybe stewing. I didn't check. I didn't care. Something strange happened after that night. I began to feel lighter. Not happier. Not yet. But freer. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. I started working out again. Waking up early. Reading books I'd left gathering dust on the shelf. My mind felt clearer without the emotional weight of constantly waiting for validation. Then one day, I got an email from a contractor I hadn't heard from in months. Someone Delphine had referred for Myra's second renovation attempt. Hey, just confirming. They said you'd be covering the new tile job too? I replied with 2 words. Not involved. Silence. Sweet silence. From that point on, I stopped bracing myself for the next manipulation, the next insult dressed as a joke, the next request laced in fake warmth. I knew what I was now. I was no longer the man who pays but isn't family. I was the man who remembers everything and forgets nothing. I left the house before sunrise. Not out of anger. Not to make a scene. Just a quiet decision after too many days of watching my own reflection fade in a home I no longer recognized. I had packed a small duffel bag the night before. A few shirts, a laptop, my documents, and the spare keys to a condo I'd bought 5 years earlier, back when I still believed in the concept of future-proofing my life. The condo sat on the 9th floor of a high-rise on the quiet side of the city. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the skyline, and the one thing I hadn't realized I missed until I opened the door, space to breathe. The silence there was different. Not the tense kind that sat between 2 people in a house that had grown too big with emotional distance. No, this silence was clean. It was mine. I dropped my bag, exhaled, and let the weight of months fall off my shoulders all at once. For the first time in years, I was alone with my thoughts, and they weren't screaming. Adeline didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. Maybe she assumed it was another phase. A silent protest that would end with me crawling back to her side like I always had. Or maybe she simply didn't notice. I wasn't sure which truth hurt more. 3 days passed before my phone buzzed. It was Mira. We need help finishing the foundation work at Mom's place. You know she's getting older. This delay is stressing her out. No, hi. No, how are you? No acknowledgement of the last conversation. Just another request. Another assumption. I stared at the message for a few seconds, then tapped the call button. She answered on the second ring, as chipper as ever. I knew you'd call back. she said with a smug little laugh. Seriously, though, the builder is being difficult. He says without a new deposit, he won't finish. I'm sure Mason can handle it. I interrupted calmly. There was a pause. Mason? She asked. But he had a lovely wedding. I continued. Didn't he? She didn't speak. I let the silence stretch. I wanted her to feel what I had been feeling for months. That tight, sinking quiet when someone forgets you on purpose. When they leave you behind and pretend it was an accident. The line clicked. She had hung up. I smiled. Not a cruel smile. Just one of realization. The thing about silence is that once you stop filling it for other people, it becomes a weapon they don't know how to defend against. They're used to your yes, your convenience, your explanations. When those disappear, so does their control. Days passed. No more calls from Mira. No text from Delphine. Not a single word from Adeline. And for once, I didn't wait by the phone. Instead, I worked. I set up my desk near the window. I opened projects I'd been meaning to start for years. I cleaned out my inbox. Caught up with old clients. I even reached out to a few nonprofits that had been sitting on my radar. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about living in my own name again. I cooked my own meals, played jazz in the mornings, and sometimes just sat in silence, staring at the skyline, thinking about nothing in particular. That to me was the greatest shift. I wasn't constantly rehearsing arguments in my head anymore. I wasn't defending myself to ghosts. One afternoon, I walked to the cafe down the street. A new barista named Jen took my order. She smiled when I told her my name, scribbled it on the cup, and said, "Nice to see a regular face." Most folks around here just glare at their phones. Trying not to be one of them anymore, I said. She grinned. Good luck. That night, I checked my phone again. Still nothing. But it didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like peace. And just when I thought they'd finally decided to leave me be, Delphine called again. This time, her voice was different. Edgy. Forced calm wrapped in panic. The roof is leaking, she said without preamble. The builder is threatening legal action. What is going on? I looked out my window at the city lights and sipped from my mug before responding. I'm sure Mason or Adeline can help, I said, mirroring her own dismissiveness. They said it was your responsibility, she snapped. And there it was. The truth they'd never admit openly. I had been the backbone of their comfort. The unspoken agreement was that I would pay, fix, provide, protect, and ask for nothing in return. Didn't I tell you? I said softly. What? I let the words sit. Let her feel the same chill I'd felt when her daughter showed me wedding photos I didn't know existed. Let her choke on the same emptiness I'd swallowed for years. Didn't I tell you? I repeated, and then ended the call. An hour later, Adeline finally broke the silence. She didn't call. She came. I heard the knock at my condo door around 9:15 p.m. When I opened it, she stood there in a coat too thin for the cold and eyes red like she hadn't slept. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered. I stepped aside but didn't say a word. She walked in slowly, looking around like she was seeing me for the first time in years. This place is nice, she said, voice small. I nodded. She sat down on the edge of the couch, twisting her hands together. This is your family too, she said, barely above a whisper. You can't just leave them like this. No, I said, standing near the window. Family doesn't erase you from photos, or celebrations, or homes. She looked down at her hands. I made a mistake, she said. I didn't think it would matter. That hurt more than anything. You didn't think it would matter. I didn't reply. She looked up. Can we talk? I let the silence answer. And for the first time, she sat in it. No defenses. No jokes. Just her, staring at a version of me she hadn't met before. The one who wouldn't carry shame that didn't belong to him. When she finally stood up to leave, she turned to me. Do you still love me? I looked at her, long and steady. I love who I used to be when I was with you, but I don't miss who I became. She nodded, eyes welling up, and left without another word. And I returned to my silence. Not because I was broken, but because I was finally whole. When people underestimate you long enough, you stop correcting them. You let them believe what they want. That's what I did. For years, the Andersons treated me like I was just an IT consultant, just another tech guy who got lucky marrying into their family. They never asked deeper questions about what I did, how I built my business, or why I never seemed to stress about money. They weren't interested in my world, just in what I could offer theirs. That suited me fine, because the less they knew, the more control I had. They didn't know I owned the consulting firm I worked at. They didn't know I'd purchased rental properties across the city through a holding company with a generic name they'd never recognize. They didn't know that half the people they gossiped about at brunch, landlords, HOA board members, building inspectors, had my number saved in their phones. And they had no idea that Delphine's beloved house, the same one I helped save from foreclosure 5 years ago, was still tied to a lien I held quietly, legally, and indisputably. Back then, Mason had gotten himself into some gambling trouble. He asked his mother for help. She, in turn, asked me. The house was at risk, and they needed a cosigner to keep the second mortgage from collapsing. I didn't ask questions. I just signed. Of course, I made sure the paperwork protected me. A quiet clause in the agreement allowed me to convert the lien into an enforceable debt if certain conditions weren't met. They weren't, not by a long shot. And now, as I sat in my condo, watching the evening traffic drift like ants below, I realized I was holding something far more powerful than anger, leverage. Theo came over that night. He had a thick folder with him, updated LLC records, new legal notices, and a summary of every transaction we were moving under private control. This one, he said, pointing to the page with Delphine's property, is your ace. The city inspector's report is enough to trigger the debt clause. If you wanted, we could move to seize her equity within 30 days. I didn't smile. Not out of restraint, but because there was nothing to gloat about. I don't want the house, I said. Theo raised an eyebrow. Then what do you want? I want them to feel it, I said quietly. I want them to know what it's like to live with the sound of a door closing in their face. He nodded. He understood. We finalized the documents. My ownership's now public. My involvement, now official. All renovations routed through my firms, canceled. All scheduled maintenance plans revoked. They'd have to go through new inspections, new estimates, with contractors who didn't know them, and certainly didn't care about their last name. The Anderson family facade, polished smiles, borrowed charm, whispered judgments, was beginning to show its cracks. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't announce anything. I just let the systems do what they were designed to do. A week later, I got an email from a property manager, confirming cancellation of the upcoming roofing work for Ms. Anderson's residence. Client unable to verify authorized payment source. A day after that, Myra's name popped up on my phone. I let it ring out. Then she sent a voice note. You really think this is funny? Mom's stressed out of her mind. The new contractors are asking for upfront deposits we can't cover yet. You know how long it takes to get approved for a new loan? You're making this harder than it needs to be. I played the message twice. Not because I was unsure of her tone. I just wanted to hear how deeply she believed I still belonged to their service. A few hours later, Mason texted. Not sure what's going on with Mom's house. Can we talk? I didn't reply. That night, I received a message from someone I didn't expect, Lucy, Mason's wife. We'd never been particularly close. She was always pleasant, always neutral. I used to think it was because she was shy. Now, I realized she was just observant. She hadn't joined the laughter when I was erased from Mason's wedding. In fact, I barely saw her in the photos that Adeline showed me. Her message was short. I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I had, I wouldn't have gone through with it the same way. You deserved better. I read it twice, then locked my phone. The next day, I stopped by one of the properties I owned in the Eastwood district. It was an apartment complex with 12 units and a management team that answered directly to me. I stood in the courtyard for a while, listening to the sound of kids playing nearby, watching tenants go about their evening routines. It reminded me of how much I'd built quietly, carefully. While everyone else was busy judging appearances, I was investing, protecting, preparing. I remembered a night years ago when Delphine had joked that I wasn't ambitious like Mason, that my job was cute but not impressive. I had laughed then, shrugged it off. But now, as I stood on the balcony of my own building, I realized I wasn't the quiet one. They were the blind ones. And their ignorance had been the greatest gift they ever gave me. A few days later, Theo called. They got the letter, he said. Delphine's hired a new attorney. She's panicking, trying to renegotiate terms on the lien. And she can't. You gave them 5 years of goodwill. You're within your rights. I exhaled. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was just done. And being done is one of the most powerful feelings in the world. I ended the call and looked around my condo. The light was soft through the windows. The air was clean. My inbox was quiet. My conscience, even quieter. They could keep their laughter, their brunches, their weddings. I had my name. I had my voice. And finally, I had my peace. It happened faster than I expected. The unraveling. The chaos. The slow public exposure of everything they tried to keep wrapped in artificial grace. It started with a voicemail from Delphine, shaky, out of breath, and no longer laced with superiority. I need you to call me back. Please. The new builder's threatening legal action. Says we defaulted on the revised contract. I didn't even know there was a new contract. They said it was under your name. She sounded like a woman who had lost control of the narrative. And for the first time, I didn't. I never called her back. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I needed to protect myself from becoming their crutch again. That same day, I got a text from Adeline. It was long. Too long. I didn't even read it all the way through. Just skimmed over phrases like, I didn't know it would get this bad, and there's still family, and we shouldn't let money destroy everything. Money didn't destroy anything. Silence did. Entitlement did. The belief that I would never push back did. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by my window. Below, the city moved on without any awareness of the storm circling the Anderson name. The same people who once laughed behind my back were now realizing that they had built their comfort on foundations they didn't own. A few days later, Adeline showed up again. She didn't text, didn't call, just knocked. I saw her through the peephole, hair tied back, no makeup, wearing the navy blue sweater I'd bought her 3 birthdays ago. I opened the door slowly. She didn't say anything for a few seconds. Just looked at me, eyes searching. Can I come in? She asked. I let her. She sat on the edge of the couch like she had during her first visit, only now her shoulders slumped with something heavier. We're in trouble, she said. I know, I replied. She glanced up at me, surprised I wasn't offering comfort. I didn't move to sit beside her. I stayed standing. They're falling apart. Mom can't refinance the house because of the lien. Myra's business partner backed out. Mason and Lucy are fighting almost every day. It's like everything is just breaking. I nodded. Because it was never built properly. She blinked, stunned at my calm. I didn't come here to beg, she said finally. I just needed you to know that it's not all jokes and brunches anymore. We're dealing with real things now. Good, I said. Real things are overdue. She flinched a little. You think we deserve this? I think consequences are part of adulthood, I answered. And I think when you leave someone out, repeatedly, cruelly, carelessly, you don't get to act shocked when they stop playing their part. She went quiet again. I came to ask for dinner, she said finally. Not a favor. Not money. Just one dinner. Just to talk. I tilted my head, studied her for a second, and then said, I'll think about it. The next day, I didn't go to work. I took the morning off and drove past Myra's salon. It had a big For Lease sign taped on the glass. I parked and stepped out just to get a closer look. The space was empty now. Chairs gone. Reception desk removed. A faded poster of Myra still hung in the corner window, smiling beside a curling iron and the slogan Confidence starts here. Ironic. I stood there for a moment, then got back into my car. Later that afternoon, I stopped by one of my commercial properties. Theo had arranged a meeting with a new tenant. An up-and-coming design firm looking for office space. I toured them through the building, shook hands, negotiated with a clear mind. It felt good. Clean. Purposeful. After they left, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Adeline. And 1 voicemail. I hesitated, then hit play. I know you think I don't care. I know you think I was part of everything that happened, but I wasn't trying to hurt you. I didn't want to rock the boat. I thought it was easier to let things slide. And now everything's capsized, and I get it. Maybe I deserve this. But I do miss you. I miss how you used to take care of everything. I miss who we were before all of this. I deleted the message. Not out of spite, but because I didn't want to carry her longing when she had never carried mine. That night, I cooked for myself. Steak, roasted garlic, sautéed vegetables. I set the table, lit a candle, ate slowly, savoring the silence not as punishment, but as presence. My presence. I remembered how many dinners I had spent surrounded by people who looked through me, how many events I had paid for but hadn't been welcomed at, how many laughs were shared at my expense while I smiled politely and poured the wine. Now I was alone, and it was the most peace I'd known in years. The fall of the Anderson family facade wasn't loud. It didn't come with breaking headlines or dramatic public arguments. It came in quiet losses, canceled projects, frozen accounts, failed loans, broken relationships, things they'd taken for granted slowly slipping away. And not once did I have to raise my voice. They unraveled themselves. I just stopped holding the thread. The news came through a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. His name was Ray, and he used to be Mason's co-worker, one of the few decent people in that circle who had eyes, ears, and a conscience. He called one afternoon while I was reviewing lease renewals in my condo office. "You hear what happened with Mason and Lucy?" he asked. "No," I replied, already knowing it wouldn't be good. "They're separated. She moved out last weekend, took all her stuff, and went back to her sister's place. Told everyone at brunch it was because of what happened with you. Said the family's treatment of you made her sick." I blinked, sat back in my chair. "She said that. Word for word," Ray said. "Apparently, she didn't even know about the wedding stuff until someone brought it up at a dinner. When she found out you weren't invited, and the way they laughed about it, she lost it. Said if they could do that to you, they could do it to anyone." I didn't say much after that. Just nodded, thanked him for the call, and hung up. It should have made me feel victorious. It didn't. All I felt was confirmation. Confirmation that I had never imagined the cruelty. That I wasn't overly sensitive. That the quiet way I'd been pushed aside was, in fact, real and visible to others. I went for a walk that evening. The streets were lit with that soft golden hour hue that makes everything look cinematic. People walked their dogs. A couple laughed outside a bakery. Life moved on. My heart felt oddly still. Mira got engaged around that same time. Word spread quickly. She'd posted it all over social media. Close-up shots of the ring. Long captions about love and second chances. But what stood out wasn't the announcement. It was the silence that followed. No one offered to pay for her venue. No one offered to host. Even Delphine, once the queen of arranging events for her children, was suddenly occupied with repairs and contractor disputes. The financial safety net I had quietly provided for over 5 years had vanished, and with it, their image of effortless stability. A week later, Mira called me. I didn't answer. She texted instead. "I just want to know if we can be civil. I'd still love to have you at the wedding. You're important to us." I read it, deleted it. I wasn't angry, just done. That same night, I received one more message. From Adeline. It wasn't long. "I miss how you used to take care of everything." That line hung in my chest longer than I wanted it to. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't accountability. It was nostalgia, selective and convenient. She missed the ease I created, the invisible scaffolding I built around all of them, so they could shine while I faded. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood by the window and looked out at the city again. Every time I did, it reminded me of who I was outside their orbit. A man who could build, protect, think, provide. Not because it was expected, but because it was who I am. They never really knew that man. They only knew the quiet husband, the predictable provider, the man who folded napkins and laughed when they joked at his expense. I was not that man anymore. And strangely, I felt sorry for Adeline, because she was mourning the wrong thing. She thought she missed me, but what she really missed was control. 2 days later, I got a call from Theo. "Thought you'd like to know," he said. "Delphine's attorney reached out. She's trying to settle the lien out of court. They're terrified the house will be listed." "Let her sweat," I said. "Already is." We shared a quiet laugh. Then he said something that caught me off guard. "Ever thought about letting go entirely?" I paused. "What do you mean?" "I mean the paperwork's done. You're protected. Their access is cut. You've made your point. Do you want to stay tethered to any of it? Or do you want to walk away clean?" I didn't answer immediately. That night, I sat alone on my balcony, the air cool and still, and really thought about it. For the first time since this began, I considered what it would feel like to stop not just responding, but remembering. Not just defending, but detaching. To stop letting them rent space in my mind. To let the chapter close, no final paragraph, no dramatic ending. Just a silent page turn. It felt possible. And that was enough. So when I woke the next morning, I called Theo back. "Start the process," I said. "All of it. All of it. Cut the lien. Finalize the property transfers. Close out anything still tethered to their names or their chaos. Let them live in the world they created, without me. Because that's what they chose. I was just honoring it. It's been almost a year now. A full turn of the calendar since the day I stood in my own kitchen and was told, without hesitation, without apology, that my wife had attended her brother's wedding without me. A year since Mira laughed from the couch and asked, "Didn't we tell you?" while her mother sipped wine like I wasn't standing in the room. A year since I folded napkins with hope in my chest and went to bed with silence in my lungs. And now? Now I live in a home that I chose. Every piece of furniture was handpicked by me, not bought to impress anyone or match someone else's idea of elegance. My mornings start with peace. My nights end without noise. I don't check my phone, bracing for another passive-aggressive text. I don't carry invisible debts for invisible roles in a family that never truly welcomed me. I carry only myself. And that has been enough. The condo, my condo, has become something I didn't know I needed. A refuge, not from the world, but from the version of myself I used to be. The man who explained too much, gave too much, waited too long for people who would never clap when he walked into a room. The silence is no longer a wound. It's a wall I built, brick by brick, to keep out noise I no longer accept. Last week, I hosted dinner. A small one. Nothing extravagant. Just a few people I trust, people who never made me prove my worth. Theo brought wine, of course. He's become more than just my lawyer. He's my anchor in storms I didn't know I was allowed to step out of. My sister, Nadia, flew in from Florida with her boyfriend. She used to worry about me. Now she just hugs me longer and smiles wider. We sat around the table, my table, and passed plates without judgment, without tension, without pretending. It wasn't fancy. No caterers, no floral arrangements, no performance. Just laughter, real stories, and clean plates. Sometime after dessert, Theo leaned back in his chair and asked the question I knew was coming. Do you ever hear from Adeline's family anymore? The room got quiet, not uncomfortably, just curiously. Everyone looked to me like they were waiting for some dramatic revelation. I smiled. Not anymore, I said. I finally got the hint. Laughter followed, warm and knowing. And that was it. The chapter closed with a single sentence. No rage. No revenge. Just a fact. I hadn't blocked any of them. I hadn't sent cruel messages or broadcasted their downfall. I simply stopped showing up where I wasn't seen. Stopped carrying weight for people who would never lift mine. That was my justice. And it was enough. The next morning, I got up early and went for a walk. There's a trail near the condo that leads down to a quiet park by the water. I go there often now when I want to think, when I want to feel grounded. There's a bench I like. From there, I can see the reflection of the city skyline on the lake. The same skyline I used to stare at from my office window during sleepless nights, wondering if I was the problem, wondering if maybe I wasn't trying hard enough to earn a seat at their table. But sitting here now, I understand what I didn't then. It was never about trying harder. It was about realizing I was trying for the wrong people. People who mistook kindness for weakness. People who saw silence as consent. People who believed being family meant being owed. I stayed in that system for so long because I thought loyalty meant endurance. But loyalty without respect is just self-abandonment dressed up in polite manners. And I'm not that man anymore. I've rebuilt my world now. Smaller. Tighter. Built not on obligation, but on mutual presence. No more pretending. No more squinting to find value in people who refuse to offer it freely. Sometimes, I see glimpses of the Andersons in public posts, someone tags Mason in a group photo, or Mira uploads a story about her wedding planning struggles. I scroll past. Not with bitterness. With disinterest. They live in a chapter I've already closed. Adeline? She tried reaching out a few more times. Once through email. Another time through a letter she dropped off at the front desk. I read the first paragraph. That was enough. The rest, I let go unread. She said she missed me. But really, she missed the convenience I offered. The quiet man in the background, solving problems without being seen. That version of me is gone. Buried beneath every unpaid debt, every inside joke that left me out, every party I funded but was never truly invited to. And what replaced him? A man who smiles when his phone is quiet. A man who eats alone when necessary and never feels alone. A man who hosts dinners around tables he built, chairs he chose, with people who show up without needing to be convinced to care. So if anyone ever asks what happened to me, where I went, why I don't speak, why I never returned, I'll say this. I didn't leave with anger. I left with clarity. And when they finally realized what I carried, I was already gone.